Okay, cool.
Let me know if it comes up. Hello, people. We have had a few potential false starts, well, definite false starts already. We have no idea whether you can hear us and see us. We've been in this situation before, and I've repeated pretty much what I've said right now, and it turned out you couldn't hear or see us. So I don't know, Sean, can you see anything on the page? Is anything coming up?
Yes, yeah, it does look like it's working now. So
Hurrah! Oh
finally,
my God, we got there. Cool. Well,
yeah.
welcome everyone. Hope you've had a great week and Happy New Year and Christmas and all that kind of jazz. Um, we are going to be talking a bit about tree surveys for bats, and this is a topic that's very close to both mine and Sean's hearts, kind of having expertise in both ecological and arboricultural industry. I'm just going to minimize the window. I can see a 20 video of me, but 20 seconds delayed on that screen. So I'm going to get rid of that a second just so I can kind of concentrate. So hopefully, if you can keep an eye on the screen, Sean, if I
Yeah, no
actually
problem.
then
I've got
share
that
my
open, and I'll keep an eye on the chat for now.
if I share my slides, hopefully it will come up. I'm not sure whether it's just going to keep showing us the video of us, so hopefully people can see slides.
Yeah, I think the slides seem to have shown up. Yeah.
Wicked, cool. All right, we got there in the end. Great stuff. Cool. So finding bats in trees is hard. It's difficult, right? That they move every few days and they leave little trace behind when they're gone. Kind of added to that, we just don't really know enough about the species we're working with, in particular when it comes to the species that roost in trees. But we've come a really long way in a relatively short period of time, and we kind of want to talk about, well, where do we go next? So we're going to be talking about the I say new bat survey guidance, the 2020 what's it 2024 version, 2023 version, fourth edition. We're going to recap on like where we've come from. We're going to talk a bit about kind of views on the current version, the fourth edition, and then we're going to talk about where we're going to go from here and how we take the next step forward. And if you kind of agree with what we're suggesting, we will encourage you to give it a try. We want to kind of work as a community, I guess, and work out how we take the next step. So we want to hear back from people about whether you think this will work, whether you think we should change it, and understand if there's any barriers in the way as well. So let's take a look back, first of all. So we saw our first set of bat survey guidance in 2007. Trees then had their own chapter, but interestingly, they sat after underground surveys. So it talked about buildings, preliminary roost assessments, as we now know them. Then it talked about underground surveys, and then it talked about trees. And I think this kind of reflects how little we knew about trees, bats in trees at the time, because it was kind of pushed towards the end of the document. The We kind of see the introduction then of a kind of system, and this was a system developed by a consulting firm. And presumably what happened at the time is that they spoke to some people and said, like, well, what are we going to recommend in our first edition of the guidance? And this firm came along and said, well, we do this. We categorize them as high, moderate, low, or negligible potential. And the ones that are high, they get some survey. The moderate or low, it's kind of basic precaution, avoid impacts where you can, but the kind of no need for extra survey, and obviously no need for surveys for trees that are negligible. And so it's kind of a starting point, I guess, that's making some effort, trying to categorize trees as to their relative value with regards to the types of bats that they will support. We then fast forward to 2012 and trees move around. So instead of having their own chapter, they now sit within a larger roost chapter. And we see a kind of similar categorization system, but we have an extra category being added here. So we had three before, with some surveys being recommended for high suitability trees, but now we've got four categories, and actually we've got some surveys being recommended for either those with high suitability or those with, quote, definite potential. We then have a category where like the tree's big, but there's nothing visible, so there's no obvious potential roost feature. And then there's kind of final category, which is the tree is so small that it just doesn't contain potential roost features. And so we kind of see this bit of a step forward, I guess, in the way that we had three categories before, but only one of them required some surveys. We now have four categories, and half of those categories require some surveys. It doesn't specify how many surveys, but just some. And again, this was a kind of protocol adapted from a consultancy who presumably kind of came forward with this and said, like, this is what we do, and VCT like that and adopted it within their guidance. It allows for professional judgment, which is really crucial, I think. But what's quite interesting is that we see perhaps how undervalued trees are because they're put just within a roost category or roost chapter, sorry. And trees occupy 2 pages out of a 100-page guidance document. So really, really small amount of information. And just to kind of cast your mind back to what the situation was like in 2007 and 2012, if you can't quite remember, in these the first two editions of the guidance, we had kind of a list of features that could support roosting bats. And this was borrowed, I think, from the Arbor Association Guidance Note 1. And you'll notice one of the features listed there talks about dense epicormic growth. If you don't know what epicormic growth is, it's this stuff over here. It's the kind of dormant buds, it's the adventitious shoots that typically develop after wounding or some kind of change in a tree. What the people who wrote this guidance were actually intending to write about was this stuff, woundwood. And this came down to kind of a misunderstanding, a miscommunication between ARBs and ecologists, basically, that they kind of just mislabeled the thing they were talking about. So as recent as the first two editions of the guidance, we had like actual errors in the guidance itself. To also help cast your mind back to that time, in the first two editions of the guidance, it refers to a CD-ROM. You might be familiar with it. I've got one on my shelf here. CD-ROM. I cannot remember the last time I used a CD-ROM or a CD. I don't even know how I would access the information on this CD-ROM anymore. I don't think any of my laptops have a CD or DVD drive on them anymore. So that kind of just shows like how far, just technologically, we've come in that time. We then jump forward to 2016 and we see a few changes here. So interestingly, the name of the guidance changes, and this is then changes to guidance for professional ecologists. So presumably excluding other people from the guidance because it was just good practice guidance up until this point. But we see this shift to renaming to be targeted just at ecologists. We see a kind of a move of the trees again. So that roost chapter has changed again. And here we have a tree and woodland chapter, and they're combined essentially. We saw in the first set of guidance, we had three categories, then it went to four categories. We dropped back now to three categories. But we do see a specific number of surveys recommended for those two categories. So if it's high, we have three surveys. If it's moderate, we have two surveys. We see some other big changes in this guidance as well. So for the first time, PRF inspections, kind of aerial climbing inspections, call them whatever you want to call them, are recognized. And we see a kind of a three-stage process being suggested, so that we start with ground level surveys, like on the left-hand side photo there. Then we move to a PRF inspection. So we want to get up and close to that inspection to have a look at it, to assess whether it's suitable, whether it's physically big enough, what the internal conditions are like. However, having done that, it suggests that we come back down to earth and we do the remainder of the presence absence surveys if they're needed via emergence or re-entry surveys. And shortly after this was published, there was kind of a boom in kind of interest and the popularity of climbing surveys for bats, and more people were climbing. We began to realize just how valuable that was as an approach. We're going to get better results. We probably get more done in a day. It means you've got evenings free then to do other emergent surveys if you want to. And if nothing else, it's just great fun, right? And so we kind of collectively as a community said like, we think we can do this better. And instead of climbing the tree, then coming back down to earth, and as standard doing emergent surveys or re-entry surveys, actually we can replace that final step with just more inspections of the feature itself. So we identified a better way of doing it, and we just did it, and it became commonplace. And I'm sure many of you watching now make some of your income from climbing inspections for bats in trees. So we got rid of that, and then we just replaced it like that. This is the power of what we can do as a community. And we all awaited the fourth editions of the guidance, and we were kind of interested to see how it was going to change. We saw big changes in that time, both in kind of the common practice of climbing trees, but also our knowledge of bats in trees. And that's largely due to the kind of citizen science uh, project of the Bat Tree Habitat Key, and huge amount of work that was put into it by Henry and other key people, but anyone who's ever submitted a record to it as well. But it came along, and I was kind of disappointed, really. We see some changes here. So we still have a trees and woodland chapter. We still have 3 categories, but in actual fact, fewer of those categories require extra surveys. So it's only that kind of the top category was previously called high suitability. It's now called PRFM, this idea that you've got multiple bats or maternity roosts, whatever way you want to phrase it. And actually then those other features which are suitable, but perhaps only for smaller numbers of bats, they're kind of just dismissed and said, okay, well, perhaps we approach this a different way and we just mitigate and we compensate for those features that we find. So it kind of feels like a bit of a step backwards to me. And this idea of PRFM, PRFI, that was one of the big changes that was brought around, doesn't really feel like it's changed a great deal to me, because it was always the kind of high significant roosts and those other types of roosts anyway. Those 2 categories I think already existed. And when I was putting this together and comparing it to where we came from and how we've got here, I kind of think that the guidance in terms of the process that we follow just hasn't changed since that first iteration in 2007. But this is despite the fact that our knowledge and our expertise has grown dramatically in that time. So to kind of dive into this a little bit, it talks about being able to identify trees and features that are likely to support maternity roosts, and those are the ones we should spend time on, and those that just are likely to support individual bats. So I don't know how well this is going to work. Can you see the chat, Sean? If I put a
I can. Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure how to set up a poll. So I think if we just get people to respond in the chat, then I
cool,
can let you know.
let's do that then. So in the chat, if you will, these 2 trees, both of them have Bechstein's roosts in them. One is a maternity roost, one is an individual male bat. Which one do you think is the maternity roost? Just kind of limited information you've got in front of you. Is it the one on the left, maternity roost, or the one on the right, the maternity roost? We'll give people a second, because I'm aware there's a bit of a delay between what we're saying here and what appears on the Facebook stream. And of course, then people need to have a look at it and think about it. And hopefully there's actually people watching. I don't know if you can tell if there's anyone actually watching, sure.
Yeah, we've got 57 people logged in at the
Okay,
moment, which is great.
cool. So we'll see what people think. Where's our maternity roost? So if you were tasked with assessing these trees, which one would you assign as a PRFM? Would it be the one on the left or the one on the right? Any suggestions? Anything coming through?
So 3 people have said the one on the right so far. I think there's a recognition here that there's a recognition that there's going to be some surprise or irony.
Fair enough. Cool. You've spotted my trap. Well done, people. Absolutely. So the one on the left was used by a individual male, whereas the one on the right is a maternity roost. And the point of contrasting these 2 things, and it's a slightly exaggerated example, but having spent several years climbing looking at trees, learning about trees, learning about bats, I don't think I can tell you whether something's suitable for a maternity roost or just individual bats. Other than it's only physically big enough to get one bat into it, I don't think it's possible. And I honestly think if I can't do it, I really would love to hear if other people think they can do this and tell me how you can do this, because I just don't think it's possible. So that was Beckstein's. I was going to ask the same question for this, but I'm sure you'd spot my trap on this one as well. Both of these are Barbasdale roosts. One has a maternity roost in it. The other is a individual male bat. And I was going to ask which one you think it is, left or right, where's the maternity roost? But I'm sure you would have guessed that actually the one on the left was used by an individual male bat, and it's just under this piece of bark here, if you can see my cursor, whereas the one on the right is used by a maternity roost of Barbasdale bats. So we see the difficulties here of this categorization system, trying to separate out multiple bats, individual bats, maternity roosts, non-maternity roosts, so on and so forth. Let's have a look at what else, some of the limitations of this guidance. So the guidance for further surveys actually only covers a very small part of the year, 5 months out of the year, May to September. And if we look at the table from the BCT guidance, we can see it here. So one of the first things that strikes me about this, up in the top left, table 6.4, it says it's an approach. It's not even the approach, it's just an approach to doing this. And then if you look at the table, I kind of feel like the table is incomplete because it says, type of bat activity, pregnancy, nursery, and mating. So that kind of period of the year where we're typically used to going out and doing surveys with bat detectors, whether it's emergent surveys, nighttime bat walkovers, whatever it is we're doing. But that's it. There's no guidance outside of that time. It kind of just abdicates the responsibility to it somewhat. We know that bats use trees all year round. So in the tree in the background here, the natter bats were present in July, as you can see. Great stuff. So we've got a maternity roost of natterers in it, but we also have a mating and a hibernation roost of nocturnal bats in the same tree. And unless we're surveying these trees at these periods, so during the hibernation period, how are we to know whether we've actually got bat roosts at this time? I presented this information last time I spoke at sorry, not last time, 2023, when I spoke at the bat conference, we presented our work on trail cameras. So they kind of, at that point, the standard survey window started in April and ran through to September. We've now seen it reduced to May to September. In actual fact, the bats are turning up in the woodland much earlier than that. So they're turning up on our cameras from March onwards. And at the other end of the year, they're hanging around much later on as well. So you can see October in the top left and top right. Down in the bottom left is November. And then down bottom right, the day before New Year's Eve, there's a Beckstein's bat still hanging around in the woodland visiting this tree roost. There are huge amount of time, months and months and months, that we're just not looking for these bats, and therefore we're not going to find them, are we? I was out yesterday collecting a trail camera as part of some work I was doing last year that was deployed in July, and took the camera down and found this little fella sitting in the roost. So to have recommendations that only extend from May to September, it's actually it's not even half of the time that bats could be using the trees. Half of the year, is it? It's a really kind of a narrow window that we're allowed to go and survey, or recommended to go and survey for bats. And essentially, within that window of May to September, what the guidance requires you to do is just put your finger in the air and pick 3 random dates. And when I say random, I don't mean random in a statistically sound way. I mean, probably open your diary and say, when can I go out and fit these surveys in? And perhaps that will be even influenced by your client and the development proposals and when they want to get in, their planning application in. And this just seems wrong to me, that surely we should be planning our surveys based on our knowledge of the ecology of the species rather than when we can fit it into our diary or when our clients want us to do the surveys. And we know we have certain species have demonstrated that Becksteins and Barbastelle are hanging out in these trees much longer than kind of originally thought. We know we have some species like nocturnes that pretty much stay in trees all year round. So if we're not surveying year round, how can we be confident that a bat roost isn't present? And this is what we find, or certainly what I find when I inspect trees and go and survey trees, is a whole lot of nothing. So this is a Beckstein's maternity roost. But when we turned up and inspected these, we did it once a month across the year. So 12 visits in a year, 4 trees. We found bats on one occasion. Like really, really low encounter rates. And a big part of that is because we're not really designing our surveys based on our knowledge of the ecology of the species. And this is where the battery habitat key really has a role to play and really helped us move forward in our understanding. And it sets out these really interesting recommendations, which on the whole have just largely been avoided, I think, by the industry because they've been seen as perhaps too costly, too time consuming, too different to what it says in guidance. And people are holding off until see they saw what the new guidance says. And sure enough, it says nothing about this. And so they've kind of been avoided. But to go back to my point, if we take nocturnal bats, they pretty much live in trees all year round. Why are we only surveying those trees between May and September? Why is there not guidance on what we do outside of that time frame? So the battery habitat key splits the year up into 6 phases, 2 months blocks essentially. January is when winter starts, and kind of then spring flux, pregnancy, nursery, mating, and then autumn flux to see us out the year. And the principle is, well, okay, if you need to know whether or not bats are roosting in those different periods, surely you need to visit. So this table kind of summarizes the recommendations for non-breeding groups, non-maternity groups. And it's not a huge amount of survey effort, really. The key difference, I guess, is that it's spread out much more. It's across the whole year rather than 5 months of the year. However, that seems to put a lot of people off. And if they weren't put off by that first stage, they seemingly get very put off by the second stage. And this is really to kind of reflect the importance of these roosts, these maternity roosts, and they're really challenging to find. That if you want to pin down whether you have one of these maternity roosts, then actually we need to undertake quite a few visits. And there's a hierarchy here. Our most important species, our rarest species are at the top, quite a lot of survey effort for those. And then it kind of drops down and drops down. And at the bottom group there, actually that's the kind of the same survey effort as was recommended on the previous table. So what we want to talk about really is about thinking about when we plan our surveys. So this whole thing about maternity roosts, I get it. That's a lot of survey effort. That's kind of what we were trying to help out with the trail camera work that we're doing. There will be a paper published or a few papers published on that this year. So we'll have an evidence base for that. So we can kind of ignore that table for now. And what we're going to focus on is kind of just like, okay, let's think about the calendar year and what bats are doing at that time. And are we planning our surveys at the right time, and are we planning enough of them? So looking at what data we do have, one of the key things we can kind of our starting point can be, well, what type of feature are we looking at? Are we looking at something like a woodpecker hole, which provides a void type feature? Or are we looking at something like lifting bark, which is much narrower, like a crevice type feature? And we know this has a big impact on the species that use them. We have some that are very clearly void dwellers, like Pechsteins. We have some that are very clearly crevice dwellers, like Barbastelle. We've got some that are less fussy, so nocturnes happy in either of those, both voids and crevices. So that's a kind of a good starting point. But where do we go from there then? So one of the things that the current guidance requires people to consider is this idea of PRFM, maternity roost, and had a bit of a discussion online with someone about, well, could we look at the different potential roost features and see, well, I know, for example, woodpecker holes are used both by maternity roosts as well as in hibernation. So they're kind of fairly chunky structures normally surrounded by living wood, provide nice stable conditions. So that's not really a surprise. We know that lifting bark is used by maternity groups, in particular Barbastelle. But my initial thought was like, it's probably not used for hibernation, is it? Because it's quite exposed and it's not going to provide much protection from the elements. So I dived into it and I thought, well, let's just do a bit of a review of what the database shows us. And I broke it down by different potential roost features and basically find out if they were used in this time of the year. And I thought it would be quite a useful one to say, okay, well, for some features, maybe we don't need to worry about serving them at certain times of year. But the result was that pretty much all features have been used pretty much all year round. I imagine some of these orange squares, like cankers and compression forks, are probably to do with lack of data rather than actually bats not using them. There might be some logic in squirrel holes not being used in autumn flux and winter, because if they're big enough for a squirrel to get in, if you've got a hibernating bat or a torpid bat within them, they become potentially easy prey for a squirrel or something like a stoat to consume. So there may be some truth in the two orange ones up here. But it was kind of surprising that, yeah, we can't really separate it out that much, that pretty much all potential roost features have had bats in them all year round. So what else can we add in then? We've got PRF type. We can add in habitat, surely, that we know that we have species preferences that like different things. So whether this was a male Becksteins in Parkland, we've got a tree roosting species. It's quite happy in closed canopy woodlands, quite happy in kind of more open woodlands like this as well. Whereas if you jumped out into a more intensive landscape, whether it's grazing, whether it's arable, presumably the kind of the species makeup would change slightly because it becomes a bit more exposed. Whether it's broadleaf or coniferous woodland, is that likely to have an effect as well? And in whether you kind of add in water into the kind of the mix as well. So this is Pembrokeshire. This is kind of Barbastelle country in Pembrokeshire. Is one area in Wales where Barbastelle is found, and this is one of the woodlands within that area. And so habitat has surely got to play a key role. So we can add that into the mix as well. And I think we can also then add in tree species. So this is an oak tree in a coniferous plantation. And oak has really durable heartwood. So it persists for long after the tree's died and it's decaying away there. And this is a Barbastelle roost in kind of the knothole feature on this tree. So the decay conditions, the types of features that are created are going to be very different compared to something like birch, for example, which doesn't have durable heartwood, doesn't have sapwood that is very good at defending. It's kind of much more at the live fast, die young end of the spectrum. So it grows really quickly, it doesn't invest in strength or defense. And the idea is it can seed and kind of grow elsewhere, then the original parent tree will eventually fall over. You compare that to something like oak or yew or sweet chestnut, they take much longer growing, they invest in strength and defense. And that's why we end up using the wood from those species as timber rather than use birch for much other than things like balsa or lightweight wood that's required. We also see certain types of features forming more frequently in certain tree species. So this is a partially felled union of a beech tree. You can see another included union in the background and the tree on the right there. And they're just certain features that will form more readily in those types of species. So I think we could add all of this together and use it to inform where we go next. And by that, I mean that we can query the database. I've posted a video about how you can interrogate the database with a pivot table and basically find, okay, well, what has previously been recorded? And then use that to plan what we do next. And it could be that when you put in your tree species, your habitat, and your PRF type, it's unlikely that it's going to recommend surveys all year round. What's much more likely is that there are a few records in it, and it might look a bit like this. So for whatever combination you choose, it might throw up this kind of response. And you know what? it's not that much different to what the current BCT guidance recommends, is it? But it would give you a bit of a steer to say, okay, well, instead of like cramming all of these surveys within a tight time frame, actually let's space them out over those 3 phases. And that kind of uses what has previously been recorded to inform the types of surveys and where we go next. And so I think it's kind of a useful starting point. Equally, at this time of year, we're waiting for the survey season to begin later on once things warm up and the trees are back in leaf and the insects reappear. At this time of year, you might have a return based on your tree species, your habitat, and your PRF type, where there's only records been recorded in the winter months or the early spring. In which case, you could say that and use that information to say, well, let's get started now. Let's use this downtime where we say we're quieter in the winter. We're a bit quieter, I guess, compared to summer, but maybe we can, it's another opportunity to provide services over the winter months. We don't necessarily have to tell our clients to wait, so we can keep things moving. And just as a kind of a way of stepping forward, it's an interesting concept to me. Like, why are we telling, if we have this kind of result, why are we telling our clients, oh no, you need to wait between May and September to survey this tree, if actually the data we have to date, as incomplete as it is, actually suggests that bats are roosting in it earlier in the year. That's when we should be focusing our attention. And I think we could take it to this extreme, that for the purposes of development, we should be doing surveys where there's a reasonable likelihood of us finding bats. So if we go through the process of interrogating the database and we don't get any records returning, I think there's justification to say, okay, we don't do any further surveys. And I've aired this before and it's made some people feel uncomfortable, I guess. But essentially, this is what we're doing if you categorize the tree as a PRFI. There are no further surveys. And the reason why I think we should be willing to accept that there are some trees that there's no further surveys is that there needs to be some give and some take. So on these trees, we don't recommend any surveys, but when we have a return that looks like this, surely these are the ones we should be arguing for, that they receive greater survey effort and that we extend it all year round to get a full understanding of what's going on with that tree, rather than just kind of blanket approach every single tree the same. And it's an attempt to take it away from what is essentially a subjective assessment of suitability and then picking random dates to plan our surveys, to just try to provide it, make it a bit more objective. This is these steps that we've gone through, and this is what we're going to recommend. And I'm not suggesting it's perfect. All I'm suggesting is that it's a step forward to help us along that journey. I've previously shared a video about how you can set up the pivot table. It's a little bit long-winded. It's fraught with errors. People quite often contact me and say, I can't get it working. Sometimes when the database is updated, things go slightly awry. So I'm going to hand over to Sean now, who's been working on that and trying to make the process of interrogating that database easier.
Cool. Thank you, Jim. So we have a question from John, which I think will probably address some of these questions at the end. The question was, if no one ever surveys because there's no data, we'll never have data, and that's the most common kind of question or argument against this approach. So it's a good point, and I think we'll get to that at the end. So I'm just going to share my screen. See if this works. Can you see that, Jim? Does that come up?
Yes, it's come up.
Cool. So this is a web application that I have developed over the winter to make life easier for people who want to use the battery habitat key approach. As Jim mentioned, some of you may be familiar with using the BTHK methods and have experience using the pivot tables. For some of you, this might be brand new. You may be seeing this for the first time. So kind of building on what Jim was explaining about looking at the kind of 3 main kind of points which can influence or predict presence or likely presence or likely absence, or just what's reasonable in terms of survey effort, we have three fields that you can choose from. So the top one is your habitat, so things like woodland, parkland, scattered trees. The middle one is your tree species, and then the bottom one being your PRF type. And it's very simple. Over time, I'm looking to make improve on this, but right now it's just based on data from the battery habitat key that I've spent time cleaning up. I know, again, those of you who have used the BTHK database will know that there are all sorts of records in there which can cause problems. So part of building this was just cleaning all of that data and standardizing everything. So this is available now. You can see on the address at arbology.com/nexus. You can create an account, log in, and use this now. We've had a few people sign up already, so you can work along and see how this is used. So I'll just do a couple of examples to show you the functionality. We'll start off with woodland. So the fields are autocomplete, so you can start typing woodland and it will give you these options. So we can select broadleaf woodland semi-natural to begin with. One of the habitats that we're a lot more likely to find bats using. And we'll go for Quercus robur, good old English oak. And again, we'll go for something where we're likely to get some records. We'll select woodpecker hole. So once you have your three, you click the lookup button and you will be presented with some results. So here we can see, based on the query that we've entered, which is up here, we have positive records for these 4 seasons. So we have spring flux, pregnancy, nursery, and mating. And you'll notice below, I've separated the recommendations based on the maternity groups. So in spring flux and mating, we have individual visits. And then in the pregnancy and nursery periods, we have species which are highlighted in red and bolded. Now, if you're using a dark theme or you have custom browser colors, the highlight may show up differently, but they should be highlighted. And you will receive recommendations for the maternity groups here as well. Slight caveat is if you remember back on the slide where Jim showed the recommendations for maternity groups, some of these may overlap. It's logic that I may build into the system at some point in the future, but obviously if you're doing 14 sequential visits, one visit in the second half of June will obviously be covered under that. So just use some professional judgment with that. So you can see there that we have these records based on this query. The interesting thing about this, and the nice thing about using this system compared with even the pivot table, is that you can quite quickly change your habitat, for example, or you can move, in inverted commas, your tree to a different habitat, or you can move, keep your habitat but move to a different tree species. So let's take a look at what happens if we move our oak tree from woodland into parkland. You can see that the results are very different. We have fewer results and we have more open foraging bats, which would align with what we would expect, right? So we have Leislers and nocturnal. And actually, the result here is 3 surveys. So again, as Jim was saying, using the method doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing more in terms of survey effort. It's just a different approach and thinking about a much wider kind of period within the year. So we'd be visiting once in autumn and then 2 visits spaced 15 days apart in June. So those are our 3 visits that we're used to. So I don't think from that perspective, there's much difference to what we're already doing using the BCT methodology other than the extended period and having a bit more specification in when we're spacing these out. So 2 visits spaced 15 days apart is not something that we would be aware of if we never looked at the BTHK methodology. So another thing that we can do is if we go to built up areas, we can see if we have any trees with woodpecker holes there. And so far, we don't have any records for woodpecker holes in oak in built up areas. So arguably, as Jim has mentioned previously, we may not it may not be prudent to focus our survey efforts in these environments for development purposes. Where we may want to focus our efforts is if we have, for example, a built-up area here, and then we have our buffer zone, for example, extends into the woodland, and we go back to our semi-natural woodland. Surely we should be focusing our survey effort here. Does that make sense?
Lovely. Thanks, Sean.
No worries.
I think we can also kind of spin it around the other way slightly as well. So Sean shared an example of Parkland there, where there were Liza's maternity roost, as well as nocturnal and autumn flux. So we're talking November, December time. If you work on planning applications that go to appeal, you might have experts involved in that. And it's a really obvious flaw if you've come along and said, well, I'm going to survey it as per the BCT guidance between 3 visits between May and September. If I was the expert opposite you, I could say, well, I've looked up what's previously been recorded in oak in a woodpecker hole in Parkland. And actually, there's evidence that nocturnes use it in November, December. So why did you not survey it in November or December? So I think it's a really obvious way it can be turned around like that as well in terms of critiquing your work. That why are we just picking random dates? Why are we not basing it on what we know about the ecology of the species? And crucially, this what we're trying to do is find a jumping off point, and we're really interested to hear what people think. So we thought about this a lot. We think this is the really obvious place to start with those three characteristics, sorry. But equally, we can add more or we can take them away. And so it's not meant to be dogmatic. It's not meant to say this is exactly how you should do it. And it can be applied to site specific circumstances. So, for example, if you look up the data we have on desiccation fissures for bats, it's these dead sections of wood that dry out and then eventually kind of drying wood shrink. So it kind of, you have these fissures open up. All of the bat roosts are in desiccation fissures in stems. So if you have one of this a desiccation fissure in a limb, you can make the argument that you don't survey the limb. You just kind of carry on, right? So if you've only got desiccation fissures in the limb, you can potentially do away with surveys. Equally, if you look at the results for maternity roosts, we find the vast majority of them are 5 meters plus. This is something reflected in the Bat Roost in Trees book. So if you have a woodpecker hole, say in oak, in woodland or parkland or whatever it is, but is below a certain height, maybe we can add that in just as a kind of an extra level of kind of interrogation of the data. Similarly, we might want to go the other way. So with species like oak, we have 2 native species, lots of introduced species as well. There is an option just for putting it as Quercus spur on the database as well. So it's possible that we might want to combine those and say, instead of saying tree species, maybe we go to genus instead. Or for example, this is the only record of a bat in a manna ash, non-native ash species. And so I'm not going to suggest that we turn up and say, okay, well, it was a manna ash, and actually there's very few records, so you just kind of carry on. Presumably it would make sense to say, well, let's look at Fraxinus, let's look at the genus then, let's look at all ashes combined, rather than being dogmatic about being those 3 specific things. So there's room for professional judgment here. And equally, as I say, we want to hear from people about, is this a good starting point? Should we be considering other things? But I'll hand back to Sean to talk a bit more about adding and kind of subtracting things a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is something that you can do using pivot tables, but as Jim said, you need to make sure, for example, when you're filtering, that you add Quercus petraea, Quercus robur, Quercus spur, because just selecting Quercus spur isn't going to select all of the Quercus species that are there. So it's a bit more fiddly. So I'll go back to this. So we're back here on the battery habitat key lookup tool, and we have our broadleaf woodland semi-natural with our Quercus robur with a woodpecker hole. And you can see, again, we have records in 4 seasons. What we can do is get rid of this if we're just interested in looking at Quercus species. So if we just leave out the species and just search for the genus, we can click out the way, or if you're using a keyboard, you can tab out to the next thing, and we can do our lookup just based on the genus. And you can see that we have a lot more records because we're now including records from all of the different species in the Quercus genus here. So we've gone from having spring flux to mating. We also now have additional records within those periods, but also records from autumn and winter. So we have a wider survey window that we'll need to cover because this is a more generic search. The other thing that we can do is the same thing with our habitat. So we can change this just to woodland, and that will incorporate all of the different woodland habitat types. And in this instance, it didn't make a difference because we have the same records. They're all in the semi-natural woodland. But what we can do, as Jim mentioned before, is we can scroll down to the full data, which is below the kind of table that makes the recommendations, and then we can add and take away additional columns here that we're interested in. So if we're doing a more generic search like this one, just to confirm we're on woodland, any type of Quercus with a woodpecker hole, we can say, okay, we want to know what kind of height our maternity roosts are at. So if we add, using these buttons here, add the PRF height, and then sort by clicking on the column header by PRF height, you can sort ascending or descending. And then we'll look here. You'll notice a trend, firstly, that the bigger roosts are all towards the bottom here, so they're all much higher up, but that our first maternity groups are basically around 5 meters, 4.6 meters here. So it's a really good way to interrogate the database, use, if you need to, a slightly more generic search, but then you can do additional filtering both within the tool itself, or if you want to, you can add as many different columns as you like. And when you're happy with that, you can export that to Excel, firstly, so that you have a record of your search, but also so that you can do additional manipulation of the data if you want to.
Cool. Thanks, Sean. So the idea really is about trying to make decision making more objective, more open. We can clearly say these are the things I considered and this is the outcome. And if people want to disagree with that, then we can talk about it openly because you can say, well, how would you do it differently? Whereas at the moment, it's very much just, well, I think it's this and I think it's that. And that just means there's so much room for variation between people, between days, between sites. And so it's just trying to move away from that really. And Sean, you mentioned about a comment from John in the chats. I haven't been able to see them all. They've kind of been hidden from me a bit. You've asked about, how if we don't do any surveys, well, we'll never have any records. And I completely agree with you. But for developers, should we be asking them to fund research? And essentially, the government all along has said no, that they are only required to undertake surveys where there's a reasonable likelihood of the species being present. So we need to apply our knowledge to actually determine when surveys are required and when they're not. And we've seen this being discussed and kind of raised politically for a while. And this just before Christmas kind of reared its head again. There's the chats about this bat shed for HS2. Then we heard about the government's plan for change, and there seems to be a kind of a desire to streamline the process and for certain sites and kind of rethink how surveys and licenses are are done essentially. And this isn't new. If you look back, you go to different media outlets, you get kind of different take on it. So the Mail was always quite keen on providing like figures, how much money these protected species cost developers. Whereas, if you look at the Guardian, for example, there's lots of articles that talk about the previous conservative governments and them essentially not being much of a fan of us and what we do. And I think perhaps for too long we've hidden behind the fact that these species are protected and just need to do the surveys. These are the people who have the power to choose. Actually, they could upend the whole system. They're not a fan of the results that we're delivering. And let's face it, our track record on mitigation isn't great. The number of times people survey and don't find anything, there's no wonder that these people are upset and frustrated with us. These are the people that could rewrite those laws or rewrite the licensing policy, because in the UK, compared to the rest of Europe, we do things very differently to other countries. And that poses real threats to the ecological industry and lots of you people watching, I'm sure. So we'd like to kind of wrap up by saying this is like the start of a conversation. We've talked about this, we're making a proposal, we're interested to hear what people say about it. I've provided the caveat that, yeah, this is for development. Obviously, research is different. So it kind of depends why you're doing surveys in the first place. We're interested to hear feedback. I'm more than open to criticism. However, if you come with a criticism, I also want to hear how we make it better. I don't want to just hear criticism and say this is not good enough, it's not perfect, because that's what's caused us to stall for 16 years. The guidance hasn't changed, like realistically, in 16 years. We need to make a decision how we make one step forward. And it's going to be a little bit better on that next step. And then once we're there, we make the next step after that. We make the next step after that. We're also interested to understand what the barriers are. So hopefully Sean spending some time developing that tool will remove one of the barriers of actually understanding and interpreting the data and using that side of things. But if there are other barriers, so for example, the identification of features and how standardized we're assigning trees to woodpecker holes or squirrel holes, for example, if that's a barrier, or if there's any other barriers, we are keen to know. And hopefully then we can be part of that solution. So we can see if we can offer a solution to that. If it doesn't come from us, maybe it comes from someone else in this community. But we just need to band together and work out what is the next step that we take. So those are our email addresses. So please, if you've got suggestions, if you've got thoughts, if you like it, if you dislike it, if you've got suggestions on how we improve it, if you think those 4 criteria of tree species, feature, and habitat aren't enough or they're too many, let us know. This is the starting point of a conversation, basically. Have you shared your, I'll just put a link up for, I'm developing a bats and trees masterclass. It will be available at some point in February. So this kind of training may help out with some of those issues of identifying and classifying potential roost features. So if you're interested in that, scan that. I'm asking for kind of registers of interest at the moment, no commitment, but I'll then email everyone on that list once it's ready, and there will be a small discount compared to when it goes live organically anyway. Have you shared the link to your tool in this?
I will do that in chat quickly, but it's just if you head to arbology.com and click on the Nexus, you can sign up and create an account there, and that's free to use. You can play around with it. The idea is that this is kind of phase one. I'm speaking to BCT at the moment, and some of us have got a consultation with them next week or in a couple of weeks' time about just pushing this further, basically. But for now, I just really wanted people to have easier access to the data. So eventually there will be improvements on data entry and all sorts of other things. But hopefully this is step one, and we can get more people using this.
Absolutely.
Your just so you know, Jim, your QR code didn't your video was over the corner of the QR code, so I
Oh,
don't
is
know
it?
whether you want to just share a link as well or just tell people where they can head for that. I don't know whether people would have been able to actually scan that from the video, unfortunately, just because of where Zoom put your face.
Let's try that again then. I will share and I'll bring it up. Thanks for that. I'm sharing the wrong thing here. Ah, technology, eh? Let's bring that back up. So yeah, we are approaching the hour up. I haven't seen any more questions in the chat or in the comments section, but it kind of I can't see them all. I don't know if you can see them all, Sean.
Yeah, I
Um,
think I think the one from John was the only question as far as I saw. Um, yeah. Any other questions? Obviously, we've got a couple of minutes now, or just send us through an email.
Cool. I might bring us to a close and say, send us through an email because I
Yeah.
think the types of questions and conversations we want to have are two-way, and trying to do
Yeah,
that
sure.
through a webinar is a bit challenging, and we've only got a short amount of time left. So thanks for joining. Hope you find it interesting. I encourage you to go away, have a think about it, give it a go, come back with your feedback and your ideas. And as I say, criticism is absolutely welcome as long as it comes along with the what we do next, what we do to improve it. So yeah, thanks for your time, and we'll catch you again soon, no doubt.
Thanks everyone for your time. Take care.
Cheers.
Have a good weekend.